Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula, and the whole gang is here as we head into the home stretch of the 2024 season. Fellas, you ready to get back into it?
Yeah, it's going to be great. A few more races left on the calendar, Adam. I think with 3 sprint races in the bag to go and all 3 of us connecting in Las Vegas, it's going to be a run into the season for the ages. So very much looking forward to it. And obviously with Terry on board as well, good to have him back.
Yeah, no, it's been a while. Various track events, various other things. So it's really good to be back, and I'm absolutely looking forward to the rest of this season. There is still so much out there to play for, so it's going to be really exciting.
And we're all here because we have a very special guest to help us preview the United States Grand Prix. He's the 2023 F1 Fantasy Global League champion who just celebrated his big win at the Champions Club at Monza, and it's none other than David Jurca. David, welcome to the Fantasy Formula.
Hey, thanks for having me. Looking forward to this chat.
I think, David, we might just kick things off straight away. As Adam said, you've got a lot of experience with Formula One. You're very much involved in F1 fantasy, and as the winner of last year, we obviously have a lot of questions to ask. So I think to start with, how did you get into Formula One? Was it something that you grew up watching? Was it a family interest? And then obviously your background in karting, we'd obviously love to learn a lot about as well.
Sure. So it's a story that goes actually back to my grandfather, and he raced cars in the Czech Republic, back then Czechoslovakia. And with the communist regime, it was my family was anti-communist, and so they were in a way disadvantaged from the regime. And so that career of my grandfather sort of came to a halt when that regime shift started. And my father was always a big fan of the sport, but he wasn't able to race kind of through that regime shift. So interestingly, I think finally my family sort of decided, okay, this isn't the place for us, and actually escaped from Czechoslovakia. And so they came to America as immigrants, and I was 2 months old. And I got the bug from my dad. I started watching when I was 4 years old. I grew up in a working class family. It was not, money wasn't plentiful. It was, coming from an immigrant family and racing and trying to mix those two things was challenging. So it first started off just, a father-son kind of sport. My dad got me into karting when I was 8 years old. We did that together regionally in the Pacific Northwest, so Washington, Oregon, British Columbia, and Canada. And with some success, that sort of opened doors, and got into a national level team where I was able to sort of join the team and work out sort of support levels that wouldn't have been able to afford, but spent my summers working at their shop, was there every school break, and that then developed into something quite serious. So when I was 15 years old, it was something that was kind of a full-time focus for me, that in school.
That's really exciting. And on the screen here, we've got a photo of you with Fernando Alonso, which we'll obviously want to unpack a little bit more down the line. I think specifically in relation to F1 Fantasy, how did you come across that? Was it purely an extension of your passion for motorsports and racing, or was it something you maybe stumbled across and thought you'd try your hand at?
So I started fantasy through a friend of mine who's a former karting driver. I coached him at one point and became a friend of mine. So he started a league a few years ago, and he just consistently sort of had it going with 10 or 15 of us. And so I always played via his league. So I never looked at it as a kind of global focus. It was always try to win his league, try to have the bragging rights for that. And last year happened to be going really well, and I started to see that I was doing well, in the global rankings, and it resulted in the number one outcome, which I was obviously very, very surprised to see.
David, I want to talk a little bit about your formula for success in that championship run last year. You said in an interview earlier this season that it's important to make big changes when the time is right. And we've had a few of those moments this year too. What do you decide when it's time to switch up your team? What are some of the factors you use to make such a decision?
Yeah, so I try not to make changes too frequently, right? Because you get penalized for it. Uh, you get sort of one chip that you can make a wholesale shift, but otherwise you get limited in the amount of shifts you can make. Last year was pretty unique in that the way it was priced, there was a clear team kind of that made sense for maybe the first 10 races or so. And how I would go about making shifts or strategy changes on my team, it's not something I spent a lot of time on. So for instance, if we talk about a preview on, the next race, I suppose, is in Austin, I don't have a clear mindset or strategy for that race. I think what I'll do is I'll wait to see the first 3 practice sessions. Formula1.com, they publish analytics on qualifying and race pace simulations. And so one of the things I look at is trying to find a team or a driver that's not just going to qualify well and then not race well, so you can see, where do they stack up for qualifying prediction and race prediction. And McLaren last year happened to be, predicted to do well in the race, and their pace was legitimate. So, I took a punt on that, and it worked out.
Definitely did. That was a huge turning point in the 2023 season, and you capitalized pretty mightily for it. So, congratulations for that. And then, in your routine to get ready for a race weekend, are there any other tools leading up to free practice that you look at? Anything from gambling lines to people like Rob and myself, or tech articles for things like what Terry writes? Is there anything you do in the build up to the race weekend?
Um, my focus, and I think this is probably the biggest takeaway for anyone, especially that's new to this game, is think about it in points, like so value per point, so dollar per point spent. I think that will lead you into certain kind of base selections for your team. So as an example, right now constructors are where you get the most value for your money. You sort of get, I think, roughly 2 points per dollar spent, if I recall correctly. The best driver will give you, the ones that have done the best statistically this year will give you $1, or sorry, 1 point per dollar spent. And so that just tells me I should spend all my money on constructors, and then whatever's left over, make the most of it with the drivers. So that's kind of like my base. And then I think about, how does it look in a certain weekend? Is one team doing better than the other? And how are things priced and what can I afford? And I fill in the rest. And finally, with chips and things that can move the dial, I always try to use them in sprint races where you have more opportunity for points. So if you multiply something by 2 or 3 and you're getting more points, you have more opportunity to make a good outcome. But obviously, then some of that's down to luck, because if those assets have a bad weekend, then you kind of magnify that as well.
It's a really interesting approach, one that Adam, Terry, and I have all kind of considered most race weeks, if not every single race week, when it comes to decision making process. And I'll ask you a bit of a double-barreled question. The first will kind of go back a little bit to what I referenced before, your picture with Fernando Alonso on the screen and your karting history, and kind of how that, first of all, that competition and that friendly rivalries you had with Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso during that time of your life, kind of, if at all, affected the way you make decisions in fantasy, and whether that kind of experience or those experienced drivers maybe plays into how you gauge which drivers are ultimately the ones for you running at any single race weekend.
Yeah. Well, I'm a fan of the sport, and that the fact that I raced and did for so long has meant I've watched a lot of seasons of Formula One, so I understand the sport well. And then I read about Formula One, for fun, not just because of playing fantasy, but it helps me understand certain dynamics. Some of the drivers and the teams, and little things that can help you. Like I'll know that maybe a driver has a penalty. And last year, one of the things that really helped me is I did a triple points on Max Verstappen when he had a grid penalty. I think it was Spa, if I'm not mistaken. And so that I knew that if he went up, if he basically made those positions up in the race, then he would get triple the points on those positions gained. And so to answer your question, I think if it was strictly just the racing background, that's helpful. But maybe it's also the fact that I've transitioned my career and my background into finance. And so um, right now I'm managing money for an insurance company, and my mindset and when I'm managing money is very statistics based, or trying to maximize probability of success. And so looking for things that can increase that probability or that likelihood of making money for the client. And so then I take that kind of analytical mindset into the game. And so I'm always looking for things that kind of increase my probability of success, because I think that given there's sort of 20 plus races, it's more about consistency and doing that same
Definitely.
strategy over and over again, which I think quite a few people do, right? I think you probably, being into this sport and being into F1 fantasy and running this podcast, I'm sure you're thinking the same way and the same mindset. So
Absolutely.
then I think it's probably down to some luck and some judgment calls, I suppose. Um, Last year, if I gave you an example of a judgment call, I used a chip. I think I used my unlimited chip at a non-sprint race. I used it in Monza, and it happened to be a weekend where there was clearly Ferrari was, I think, doing clearly quite well, and so I used it there, and it worked out, and I think it worked out better than if I would have used it somewhere else. So sometimes it's about using stats, and sometimes it's about some gut feel, and probably that gut feel does come from that background in racing.
Definitely. That's a, yeah, great. I think that was a really pivotal swing in the season for a lot of people that use the limitless chip at Monza, and not just you, but a number of other fantasy managers inside, I believe, the top 10 at the season's end mentioned to us when we had them on the show last year that Monza was also a weekend that they used that same chip. Terry, just before I do pass over to you for a second, David, I'd love to just get a minute or two of your experience racing with Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton, because I think Terry, Adam, and I are all just so fascinated by your history on track with them in obviously those more junior leagues.
Yeah, so with Alonso, he's a bit older than me in terms of karting and racing background. So with Alonso is actually an event, the photo that you're sharing. He was um, kind of helping sponsor an event, or I think he was not necessarily the sponsor, but the face of an event by an engine manufacturer. So it was an international race that was occurring in Spain. And it was on his kart, so Fernando Alonso kart. So everyone was on the same equipment, same kart, same engine. And this was a global event, sort of, 40, 50 plus countries. And so there, I met him there, and I managed to win that event. So that was, quite a good outcome in that sense. But I hadn't competed, one-on-one with Alonso before. Hamilton, this was more of a one-off, but when I was 14 years old, I was overseas karting, and I happened to be with a team. We raced an event in Italy, and Hamilton was there. Hamilton was already with McLaren backing, and so he was, the eyes were on him actually in that event. And yeah, we were competing. I ended up finishing second, and it was a fun memory of mine.
David, my conversation is more around the prize and obviously your experience at Monza. So, am I right in thinking you got to select which race you went to as part of your prize, and it was a Champions Club ticket? Is that correct?
Correct, yeah. And so I got to choose the track. I think there's some exceptions, Monaco, maybe Abu Dhabi, a few others, but there's not too many exceptions, so you get a pretty nice choice. It was an amazing experience. So lucky that Ferrari won. I mean, you can see the background on the photo on the left, and we were front and center watching the crowd storm the track and that atmosphere. So kind of, aspects of winning F1 fantasy, you have to rely on luck, right? In a way, because I mean, I only won by 5 points, and I think Yuki Tsunoda was the driver of the day on the final race of the year, and I had him, and so there's 10 points. So, um, so we were quite lucky in Monza and seeing Ferrari win. The selection was actually because a friend of mine was getting married in Rome on a Thursday night, and I had a 12-month-old with us, and logistics right now is around that, and it happened to be that we're already there and made it easier. But I'm sure glad we chose that one.
Yeah, and in terms of the experience, what sort of things come with it? Because normally these things come with like pit lane walks, other sort of things. Is it just literally Champions Club, or do you get some extra bits with it as well?
Yeah, it's really nice. Like I have to say, it was such a fun experience. So the the Champions Club sort of hospitality unit is below the grandstand, so you're always able to sort of be in the grandstand, watch an event, watch a race. You can watch Formula 2 anytime, walk down, and you're immediately in the hospitality if you want a drink or food or to sit down, or even sometimes they have guest speakers. They had Emerson Fittipaldi and Gunther Steiner. So it was, I mean, it's such a privilege. It's definitely, you feel, um, the hospitality is really high standard. And then in terms of the food was great. We get to do a paddock tour, so you sort of um, have a dedicated slot, and you sort of are able to walk around the paddock for an hour. And we saw lots of people, lots of famous names. We saw team principals, saw Charles Leclerc, Binotto, we saw Toto, we saw Fred Vasseur, we saw a lot of different people. So, and you're front and center, you're right there. It's really nice.
And I imagine the experience of seeing Charles win was just something else as well. That probably made the end of it pretty special as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the seats were, like I said, above the hospitality, and they were on the front straightaway. So the start finish line was literally right in front of you, and that's where sort of the fans stormed the track. And it wasn't obvious. I mean, if you recall the race, right, it was the strategy that won for Ferrari, and so they did one less pit stop. And so it was when that sort of occurred that you actually thought, wow, they have a chance to win, because before that it wasn't. It was looking more like a podium maybe. And so from that point forward, it was about making sure that the tires last, and sort of McLaren. I think it was um, Oscar Piastri, right, that was trying to catch him and didn't quite catch him in the end. So that was really exciting. The every time Charles went by, the crowd was roaring, and the atmosphere was pretty amazing.
Counting down the laps.
Yeah.
David, it sounds like you had an amazing time in Monza, and clearly the biggest prize in all of fantasy sports looked like a really good time for you and your family. So it's so great to hear about all of the stories of a really exciting day at Monza. Now that we've gotten to know you, let's bring you and Terry into our regular show, because we have some people on our network that are gearing up for this push toward this year's top prize, and I'm sure they want to hear your perspective on some of our biggest topics for this week. So let's start with winners and losers, and Rob, tell us about a sad winner.
Yeah, it's a bit of a bittersweet moment for Australians in the Formula One world. I think we'll start with the highlights of Daniel Ricciardo's weekend in Singapore. And before we get to his dismissal from RB, want to just cover off in his fantasy performance how he did. He had his best performance of the season in Singapore after going out in not making it to Q3, I should say, not scoring a single point on the Saturday in qualifying, managed to really turn it around on the Sunday. But in part, a lot of that was primarily due to the fact that he had not only the fastest lap, but also the driver of the day vote. And I think, although a great result for him, drew a bit of, let's say, ire from the F1 fantasy community. Adam, Terry, what was your take on that for Daniel?
I think
Do you
both
wanna go
things
first,
can be
Adam?
true. We can be sad that Daniel left, and I think the fans that voted for driver of the day, they had no choice but to give him a curtain call that his team wasn't otherwise willing to do besides that fastest lap. So I think it was appropriate for them to vote for him. But for us as F1 fantasy strategists, it's also a bad beat because he was the last of the finishers. And you go back to earlier in the season when Lando won driver of the day after he had DNF'd the race. So it brings into question the viability of this scoring category. It's 10 points every week, and it's fully fan-based, and it's not performance on track. So I think if we continue to question why this is a scoring category, maybe the powers that be will reconsider for 2025.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can understand why he got driver of the day. I can understand the fans voting for him and the reasons why. But I think in terms of the amount of sheer points it brings for it to be based solely on a vote, I'm not all against removing it. Far from it. But when you got the fastest lap is only an extra point, and driver of the day is so many points, maybe just a migration towards it being less valuable in terms of points might even just be a better way forward as a short term fix rather than just making it such a big difference to someone who may run him, someone who may not, for example, for just what is ultimately that sort of hand vote.
David, yeah, in terms of Adam's question around driver of the day, do you have a view on that and whether or not that kind of comes into your thinking for the run into the rest of the year?
I mean, it does, and I think actually for this season it worked against me. I think there were, quite a few driver of the days that probably weren't the most performance based, and last year it seemed more, the votes were more performance oriented. So it's big points, it's 10 points. But I do take that into account, or I think, okay, who could be amongst the group of drivers, who's popular. I wouldn't have predicted Ricciardo last time around, but that was a unique circumstance. It worked in my favor last year. I can't say that, I had Tsunoda in the last race of the year. He led some laps. It got the emotions going from the fans, and that's probably the
sure.
difference between me winning and losing between first and second at that last race.
Yeah.
But it's certainly up to luck. It's not, it's not an analytical thing that you necessarily rely
No.
on.
No, not at all. And Adam, before I pass over to you for the loser in the Singapore Grand Prix, maybe a thought on the driver of the day is we've got two more drivers that may well be out of the sport by next year in Valtteri Bottas and Kevin Magnussen. I wonder if that factors into our decision making in Abu Dhabi for bringing maybe one of them into our teams if the driver of the day vote does come into our thinking then.
It's a very fair point, Rob. I think the sentimental driver of the day is one of the most popular reasons why I can deviate from a top driver. I'm looking ahead at Liam Lawson potentially in his 2024 debut this weekend as a driver of the day candidate. But at Abu Dhabi, there's going to be a lot of interesting candidates for it there too. All right, moving on to the biggest loser of the week. I couldn't think of a driver other than Albon and Magnussen, so I went with the safety car. We haven't seen it since the Spanish Grand Prix back in June, and now F1's gone 9 races in a row without the safety car. It's the first time it's done it since a streak between 2003 and 2004. And on that streak-breaking race in 2004, the race was won by Michael Schumacher. That's how long ago it was. So, do you think the streak will end at COTA? Will we see a safety car?
I'm really not sure, to be honest. I do think it does have a track that at certain points can certainly create some chaos going up into turn one. We know how sharp of a turn that is running up the hill, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see a couple of cars run into one another there. We've also got the sprint race, obviously, so I think that just adds another degree of DNF possibility in fantasy. So I do suspect there will be one at some point this weekend, but it has been some time since we last saw one. So maybe a bit of chaos would be good for the sport and for even fantasy.
Terry, it's been a few weeks since we've seen the safety car, and we wouldn't have even known Bernd Mailander is still on the grid had he not put the car into the wall during one of the safety tests just a few weeks ago. Do you think we'll see him again?
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, fun fact is the last one the safety car was out was when I was in the paddock at Barcelona in the safety car garage. So maybe that's the answer. Maybe I need to go back into the safety car garage. I'm certainly sticking to that one. But now I think Austin is got lots of runoff areas, so it's not as high as what Singapore was before, obviously last Grand Prix out. So maybe not this weekend, but I think next weekend certainly. I think over this triple header we're going to see Byrne back on track. That's for sure.
Let's move on now into our hit list, and I really want to pick David's brain on our first hit list topic this week because it is chip season once again. Last year, Rob, you and I had the limitless chip at COTA. We were really devastated with that illegal plankware DQ from Charles Leclerc at Lewis Hamilton. It hit us on the constructor side with Mercedes as well. We saw on the flip side, David used it at Monza and had a much bigger result. What do you think about this week, Rob? Are you ready to be heard again, or are you holding the chip?
No doubt about it. I am ready to be heard again, Adam. I am very much scarred from limitless in COTA with, as you said, those 2 disqualifications. But my bad luck has maybe come early so far this season because I don't even have the budget to move into a 3x lineup of Lando and one of Oscar and Charles this weekend. So it may well be that I park that chip until a little later this season. But I do think it is certainly becoming a very popular weekend for a number of factors. COTA typically a dry race, and I do think McLaren and Ferrari hitting their straps at the right time. The only thing that could potentially throw a spanner in the works are these Red Bull upgrades, and there's been a lot of talk about the last 4 weeks Red Bull having enough time to refine the parts needed to bring that RB20 back to a state there that it's actually competitive. So I think, David, I'd love to kind of get your take on that. Is it a weekend you're looking at a chip? Do you think the Red Bull upgrades may kind of mix things up, or is it a relatively straightforward sprint weekend for us?
Yeah, candidly speaking, I think I will definitely consider the 3X chip. That chip, I think, is sort of making itself more useful as the season goes on, because if you would have started the season, you would have wanted to use it on max, and then you would have had a hard time affording a good 2X. And as things have evolved, I too probably didn't get enough of a budget in the beginning of the year, and it's what will prevent me from winning it this year. Having a chance to win it, first of all. And I'm too far off on the budget to compete with the sort of probably elite level in F1 fantasy this year. But I will definitely consider it, and I think you can find a really good, if McLaren is fast, you could do a Lando 3X and a second McLaren driver 2X with Piastri.
Terry, let me ask you, because you've been reading a lot about the potential for upgrades. Rob mentioned Red Bull's promised some. Ferrari have confirmed they've got some, and McLaren always have a few just waiting in the wings. What are you hearing ahead of this week about which cars will be upgraded?
To be honest, most of them will. This 4-week break isn't a break in terms of production, so they've been working all the way through it, which is different to obviously the summer break where they have to have that 2-week shutdown. They haven't had that this time, so they're all running towards it. With the way the calendar is, this is going to be the last big upgrade for all the teams, for a lot of teams in terms of 2024. Some will choose to be a bit more reserved and hold some back because next year's cars are going to be an evolution of this year's car, so they won't want to show their hand too early. Some, McLaren especially, have a fear factor around introducing like the new floor. They've had that for a while. They've seen what happened with Mercedes. They're really worried that actually it's not going to do what it set out to do. So they're holding back whilst they ironically don't need it at the moment. So that's what they've been waiting on. So Ferrari are due to bring some more. McLaren are sort of, they're still toying with whether or not. Red Bull are definitely bringing some, which I imagine will include a flexi wing on the front, which they haven't brought yet. We know Ferrari brought it to Singapore. Obviously, once the FIA passed that one through, and obviously Mercedes have definitely got an upgrade package due as well in terms of the top teams. Aston Martin have got one, Haas have got one, and like I say, I imagine the rest of them will bring one. So we've seen that, certainly Aston Martin, prime example with their updates, they don't tend to work very well, certainly start off with. So we might see a shuffling in the pack with a team bringing one in and it not working. So that's going to be a really big factor. Obviously, part for me this year is going to be a bit different with the sprint weekend. They can take bits on and off, as we saw, obviously, Mercedes did in Spa with their floor, bits like that as well. So I don't think it's going to have much of an impact as what it would have had if we were still under the old part for me rules as such. So I think that actually it's not going to play that big a factor, but we might see a lot of teams struggling for setup, especially with just that one free practice.
The good news for fantasy strategists is that we're going to have the sprint qualifying, which should give us some proxy of how fast things are looking heading into the weekend. So hopefully as the week unfolds, we'll have a little bit more information at our fingertips. Yeah. Let's move on now to the next biggest asset change in the game. We talked about him quite a bit last week because it was rumored that Daniel Ricciardo would exit the grid, and that is the return of Liam Lawson. He came back to the game at $10.2 million, so less than Ricciardo, equal to his teammate Yuki Tsunoda. The question this week is he worth a punt at COTA in his 2024 debut?
Maybe I'll kick things off, Adam, if that's all right. And I think as people who have checked Lawson's price on the game will know he's come in below Ricciardo's closing price, now at 10.2 million, which I think provides some optionality in that $8 to $10 million price range. You know, we've got the likes of Albon and Hulkenberg on the screen here, as well as certain alternatives at and around that price. And I do think he certainly becomes an option for teams with maybe a little bit more budget than someone like myself. But I do think, you know, there's a compelling argument for possible driver of the day, as you pointed out before. We saw how well he did drive this time last season when he deputized for Ricciardo for a handful of races. I do think he's got a chance to really rack up the points with that impending grid penalty as well. So I'm really curious to see what he can do across all three scoring sessions this weekend. The Red Bull, not the Red Bull, the RB hasn't looked anything crash hot kind of since the mid-season break, and I do worry, even if he does start at the back, what his true upside in fantasy terms is. But I guess we'll have to wait and see what we see in sprint qualifying and practice.
Terry, I just wanted to confirm some things with you on that penalty. Are we sure it's going to happen at the sprint? And do we have any sense yet of how bad it will be? Will it be a back of the grid penalty, or will it be a pit lane start, and that could hinder his overtaking?
I'm pretty sure it'll be a 10-place one from what I'm hearing. But it does all depend on components, because he literally picks up Daniel's components. So whatever Daniel finished with, Liam picks up. There is no leeway for a change of driver. In terms of the penalty, I was pretty sure it applied to the actual race itself, not the sprint. And that's why I need to double check on that one, because I'm pretty sure that an engine penalty would have gone into the actual GP, not into the sprint.
Well, we have some homework heading into this weekend then. All right, let's see when
I would
that
second
penalty
that.
will
I think
actually
it
hit.
is
We'll definitely...
for the GP.
We're a house divided now, so we'll definitely reply back to this video. Put it in the comments what the final answer is so we can make the right decision, because it impacts a lot.
I'm pretty convinced. Yeah, I'm pretty convinced it's the GP, not the sprint. I think they're reporting it wrong.
So, David, in light of what we're hearing about Liam Lawson coming back onto the grid, how well he looked last year, are you interested in bringing him in at all at that 10.2 million price tag?
I think it will depend on a lot of factors. I mean, I can give you some of my pros and kind of what I'm thinking in the immediate. Yeah, he was impressive last year. He's been out of the car for a while. So, you know, it's going to be, he will have to get up to speed pretty quickly, you know, and Yuki's sort of well versed in the car. At 10.2, I think, like Rob said, it depends on, you know, my focus will be on my constructors and sort of, you know, the elite level couple of drivers if I can afford them, and then filling in the rest. And I might not choose a Liam because, you know, a Colapinto is cheaper. So that might be what actually dictates the end result. But to know that if he has a 10-place grid penalty, that's probably a good thing, in that I suspect he's going to want to come in and sort of do a good job and finish the race. And I wouldn't want him to sort of qualify really well and go backwards. So to start from the back, need to finish the race, maybe make a few positions, because if you guys, you know, DNF, you know, might be kind of a solid choice, actually, if you have the budget.
That's a great segue into our Fan Ant Pick of the Week question. And the question is, how will Liam qualify in the sprint qualifying compared to Daniel Ricciardo at this time last year? Danny Rick qualified P11 for the sprint. Do we think Liam will do better or worse than that? For me, I think it's going to be one or two positions lower out in Q2. Rob, what about you?
Yeah, I have to think the same. I don't think the RB is competitive enough to crack Q3. We've seen Tsunoda and Ricciardo do that on occasion so far this season, but as David pointed out, I think he probably just has to get to grips with the car, and that's, in my opinion, going to take more than one practice session and one sprint qualifying session. So I personally think it's worse than P15 or lower. He probably will escape Q1 and make it into Q2, but it'll be on the cusp. So I'm thinking, you know, P15, P16 is where I see the Kiwi driver finishing in qualifying.
David, how about you?
I think I echo Rob. I think if he gets out of Q1, he should be happy with that outcome. Given, I don't think RB is a particularly good car right now, but let's see. I think it depends on what, you know, how Austin treats the car and how Yuki's doing. You know, if you see Yuki having a shot at Q3, then, you know, maybe then you'll see Lawson doing a little bit better than that, but it depends on the car and how it suits the circuit.
And David, like you mentioned earlier, F1 puts out those simulations right after the practice sessions. If you see VCARB a little bit higher, then perhaps you make your fan pick of the week just a little bit off from what we talked about. Terry, what about you?
I think he struggled out a Q1 until I see the update list. And then I might revise it.
Fair play. And while we're on the topic of Liam Lawson, let's move on to our fifth gear GARMS contest question. As always, head on over to the Fantasy Formula base on the FanAmp app and tell us if you think Liam Lawson will outscore his fantasy performance last year at the Dutch Grand Prix. He scored 19 points in that race. We've got a sprint weekend ahead of us. I think he's going to fall just a little bit short because I think he could just be stuck coming to grips with the car like you both mentioned a moment ago, but still have an okay debut. Let's go around the horn, Rob, starting with you again.
Yeah, I think again probably will fall short. I think as a Lawson owner, if you do bring him in for this week, and you'd have to be happy with 10 or more points. We do find sprint races score a little bit more than a typical race weekend, and the Netherlands last year was a real outlier with that wet weather, which enabled a lot more overtakes. So I think it will be a real hard ask for him to get to 19, but 10 to 15, if you've got Lawson and the budget for it, I think that's probably where he's going to land. So in short, I don't think he will top his score of 19 from last year.
I sort of agree. I think 10 to 15 makes sense. Mind you, if he's worth 10 million, then that's 1 to 1.5 points per dollar spent. That's not too bad for the if you look at the stats. So if he gets the penalty, the 10 place grid penalty, then makes up some positions on top of that, he might be a safe bet. Again, if you have the budget.
Yeah, I don't think he will score. I don't think he'll get driver of the day. I think there's too much of the fan sort of outrage about how the swap was done, to be honest, for Liam to get it. So I can't see that happening from a fan voting point of view, judging by what I'm reading online. So I think for him to score 19, yeah, without sort of driver of the day in amongst the mix is going to be a pretty tall order for him.
All right. Let's look at the Fantasy Formula League leaderboard, and Porsche F1 is still on the top of our league as well as the Global League, and we'll be publishing an exclusive interview with Raheem later this week on fanamp.com, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. David, I want to close the show with some final thoughts looking ahead at the rest of the season and get some of your outlook on it. We've got some of these teams that are both at the top of the Global League and the F1 Live League in our circle, so what advice do you have for top players trying to hold on to their lead as we head into the home stretch?
Yeah, I think, last year when I actually realized I had a shot at this thing, I occasionally thought to myself, should I go for a Hail Mary? Because, a lot of these guys were kind of having the similar teams to mine, and, do I need to do something different? And so different would be sort of stepping away from Red Bull. That was last year's sort of ticket to success, right? And, should I just choose one weekend where I'm different from the rest? And what if Red Bull has a bad weekend or a DNF, and then that kind of skyrockets me to the top? I avoided that. I think I stuck to my knitting. I just, stick with that consistent approach, trying to do well every weekend on a consistent basis, trying to maximize your probability of success. So there's a lot of sprint weekend races coming up. That's probably where you want to focus your efforts. Think about how to use your chips. Don't overtrade. Don't lose, 10 points per excess trades that you would be making on a given week. It takes a lot to make that up. And then I think, know and use your money wisely and maximize the points scored per dollar spent.
David, when I talked to Raheem, I asked him if there's one question you could ask last year's winner, what would you ask him? And he wants to know, how do you go about picking your budget drivers to run week to week? Is it something that's based on value, upside, risk mitigation, history at the track? Was there any one thing that you kept going to on it?
Yeah, there's probably a few different factors. I'll try to run through a few that come to mind. So I think I mentioned earlier that you really want to maximize, getting as much value from the constructors. They're the ones who are getting you, 2 points per dollar spent if you're picking the right ones. So that if you pick the expensive ones, you don't have a lot of money left. So you get one or two really kind of elite drivers. Then the rest, if sometimes you're picking the cheapest sort of budget drivers you possibly can, so you can, get those couple of elite drivers who are going to be in the top 10. Other times, if I have more of a choice and, it's between a few drivers in a similar budget category, then yeah, I'm looking at the free practice sessions and trying to understand, what's the likelihood of one of those potentially making it into the top 10. Some teams have top 10 potential on different tracks versus others. And then finally, I'm always looking at, do I think that a driver looks like they have good qualifying pace, like a budget driver, and they make it into Q3? That was particularly, prevalent with Haas last year. If you chose them, they would qualify well, and then they would tumble down the order, and that hurts you from points. So I generally look, okay, who has maybe actually a slower qualifying pace, but a pretty good race pace, so they might move up some positions in the race. And I guess avoid where you can, risks of DNF, because that's really going to hurt you on the budget side.
That makes a lot of sense. And it all goes back to some of the race and qualifying pace simulations. You can start seeing some of those deltas unfold right in front of you. David, thank you so much for spending the time out of your day to meet with us. This has been a fantastic interview, and I'm sure a lot of listeners out there have learned a lot from you today. So thank you very much for your time, and we hope to have you on again someday.
Thanks for having me, and good luck with your season.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
And let's close our show tonight with 3 lineups for 3 budgets, looking ahead to the United States Grand Prix. Based on some of your feedback from our live show at Singapore, we've bumped up the budgets a little bit, so we're going to start at 121 million. Rob, what's looking good for you at this class?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of have to go back to what we've stressed throughout the show and really target 2 of the best constructors in the game in terms of value. And I think what we're seeing at the moment, which I'm sure both you and Terry will agree with, is McLaren and Ferrari seem to be the top dogs, not just in fantasy, but in F1 generally. So how about we start with those 2, and then you guys can maybe guide us down the driver lineups.
So for me, thinking about the 3X DRS boost, I'm keeping a really close eye on Lando Norris. I was looking at some of the lines from Las Vegas, and he is a heavy betting favorite to win the Grand Prix, so I don't think I'm going to get cute on this one. I'm going to roll with Lando Norris. If I have the 3X boost for this weekend, if it doesn't rain and the risk scenario is quite right for me, Lando's going to get that 3X boost. But Terry, let me ask you, because I have a big decision ahead on the 2X boost. Should I do Charles Leclerc or Oscar Piastri in that 2X slot?
Oh, I'm tempted to go Charles, to be honest, at the moment. I think if you take last year's performance and the way the Ferrari performed after the updates, obviously we know that, the plank wear, we're not going to have that problem this year. So I'm kind of, hedging on maybe Charles' resurgent coming up.
Let me ask you a crazy question. Maybe this is just me being a Lewis Hamilton fan. He's been second across the line in the last 4 United States Grand Prix, obviously disqualified after the finish last year. Is there something special for Lewis at this circuit? And if someone's looking to make a splash, could Lewis be an interesting punt for this week?
With their update package, yes, potentially. They've talked it up. They've talked that it's a big package, whatever's coming. So we know that Lewis wants to finish on a high. We know Mercedes want to finish on a high. We're seeing all the social media posts about the end of Lewis and Mercedes. So I'm sure that they're going to want something over these next 6 races to celebrate, that's for sure. So free practice will tell us, but Mercedes in free practice, we always don't get the full picture, do we? Let's be honest. That could go either way as well.
Yeah, I think,
Rob, you're
Terry,
keeping me honest on the screen here.
Yeah, I know. There's a lot to get through, and I think Mercedes, they do look like they are an appetizing option for this weekend. But with Leclerc, Piastri, and Hamilton all around the same price point, he just feels like the odd man out from how good McLaren are, and I think it's a toss-up between Charles and Lewis. But Adam, we've still got 4 slots to fill in this budget. I'm really not sure kind of what your vision is for a $121 million team. Do we go double premium, or do we go reliable midfield drivers?
I got so excited about my team at 126, I completely forgot we had to get through the rest of the midfield. So let's stick with Lando as our 2X driver for this week. If you're at this budget class, maybe doing what Rob's doing and holding on to that 3X boost chip until you've banked a little bit more money, can afford a double premium driver because you still have 2 more sprint weekends. I think for this circuit, I like the extra midfield option because I think you could have a lot of overtakes here. So give me a Hulkenberg, Ocon, Albon, and Colapinto sort of lineup. You've got a lot of firepower in the midfield that can get extra overtakes. So I think that's a high upside play for this week.
Very big differential on the overtakes, but if it pays off, I definitely think it could match kind of a double premium lineup with like a Sainz Russell at the double slot here. But if we move into the next budget range of the 123, kind of 124 million, which is kind of around where my team's sitting at the moment, I feel as though Terry, we'd probably again start thematically with McLaren and Ferrari. Is that kind of what you think for now? Could work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm not seeing enough from Checo's performances to make me want to go Red Bull still, even if Max comes into play, to be honest. I think that those two will just score higher just based on Checo's recent performances.
Yeah, I think kind of if we're going off kind of my team at 124 odd million, I'm running Norris and Sainz with double Williams and a Sauber driver at the bottom. I think, as Adam you pointed out, I think probably a sprint race later in the season for me is more likely, just to build a little bit more budget because I can't get to the desired Norris and Piastri combination right now. So unfortunately, we'll probably take a bit of a hit in the ranks this weekend, given how many people are likely to use it at COTA. But 126, Adam, that's kind of more within your territory of your team budget. Where do you think most teams could land this weekend for the 3X setup?
So in Terry, we trust at the top of the team. So let's stick with Lando and Charles. And then for the midfield, it's only slightly different than what you have here. I'm going with Albon, Bottas, and Colapinto, which I think tucks me right up under 126.
That's I think for like teams that would be able to stretch to an Albon. This is my second team, or my main team. I can't even get to this desired lineup, but my second team would be able to fill up a team like this. You could pivot in Piastri, but if you can reach to Albon over one of the Saubers, I assume, Adam, that's definitely the pick of the options.
I know it's been a touch and go couple of weeks for Albon owners. He had the DNF last time out. I think as long as the reliability is good for Williams, it should play well at this circuit. So hopefully Alex can deliver for us.
And then at 131.
So 131 isn't that much more attractive than the 126, unfortunately. It's really just the same lineup, only you can upgrade one of those Sauber drivers. So if you want Liam Lawson, this is where you could punt out Bottas and put in Lawson. So if you want that differential play, but this top budget isn't as big of a differential as it once was. Do either of you see anything different that we could do to shake things up here?
I don't think so. I mean, like I say, Liam over Bottas seems a safer bet. You know, Sauber's 0 points. I'm not hearing a lot of good news for Sauber fans, unfortunately, in terms of what's coming for the rest of this season or even next season, to be perfectly honest. So I think that trying to offload the Sauber drivers where you can is probably the better option, definitely.
Yeah, agreed. And luckily they've fixed their pit stop issues from earlier this year, but if you can get out of Sauber, I would as much as you can. I think budgets are going to hinder Rob and I where we have to ride at least one of them, but at this higher budget, at least you have a little bit of flexibility there. All right. That's our show for today. This Saturday, all three of us will be back on our live show for the first time in almost 2 months. So it's going to be a fully loaded live show. We'll be here 1 hour before the sprint race on Saturday and lineups locked for the United States Grand Prix. Until then, gentlemen, thanks so much for your time today, and we'll see you all on Saturday.